Hello everyone, welcome to Point of Insanity Game Studios' Geekery in General podcast. I am your host, Al. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at how to use folklore as a way to gain some inspiration for your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Now, of course, a lot of these ideas you don't necessarily have to use just in Dungeons & Dragons. They should be able to work equally well with Pathfinder or any other fantasy role-playing game out there. And with a little creativity, you could certainly use some of these ideas for games based off of other genres, whether it's horror, science fiction, or modern day. So first I'd like to discuss some terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, but are actually quite different and distinct from each other, mostly anyway. And those are folklore, myth, legend, urban legend, and fairy tale. Now let's start with folklore. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, folklore is described as traditional customs, tales, sayings, dances, or art forms preserved among a people. It can also include things like jokes, superstitions, blessings, and curses. Folklore is often centered on a specific group of people, such as a tribe, people who live in a certain part of a country, or in modern times, sometimes even people involved with a certain occupation. But the main distinguishing feature of folklore is that it is linked to the identity of a specific group. Folklore often concerns itself with the day-to-day, often discussing affairs and situations that a common person would face. Now, a good example of one of the early functions of folklore would be for safety. It's common to hear stories about a monster that lives in a forest or a river. So parents might tell these tales to their children as a way to remind them that they shouldn't swim in a certain area or wander off into the woods alone because, well, that could be dangerous. And even if we're not talking about monsters, you go in the woods, you could be attacked by a bear or a wolf. You go swimming in an area that has a strong current, you might drown or get swept away. Next are myths. Now, while folklore is often focused on the day-to-day, myths are often used to answer the bigger questions, such as where did the world come from, or what is the nature of reality? These stories often use a variety of archetypes that are found in both folklore and legend, and in a lot of cases have parallels between people from different cultures all over the world. Some of these common archetypes include stories about the origins of humans and animals, a world-ending flood, or a war between the gods that somehow fundamentally changes the world, and in some cases even creates the world. A good example is from the creation story from Norse mythology. In that story, the gods defeat the giant Ymir and then use his body to create the world. We can also find a similar story in Babylonian mythology with the tale of Marduk versus Tiamat. The god Marduk defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat, and then it's described how he uses her body to create different parts of the world. And this theme, the dismemberment of the primordial giant, is also found in other stories as well. Now, legends, these are stories that are often presented as historical events or being based on real history. However, legends usually lack supportive evidence, or the evidence that there is out there to support it is fragmented or sketchy. King Arthur is a good example. While there are people who believe that he was based on a real person, most historians believe that he's primarily a fictional character. Now, I've already talked a little bit about this topic. If you go back to episode 222 of Geekery in general, I did an episode on weapons associated with Arthurian legend. And one of the things I covered when I did the introduction is how King Arthur was seen as many things: a defender of his country, a brave warrior, a perfect king, and a valiant Christian knight. However, what aspect of King Arthur was focused upon in the story really depended on which of these qualities the author really wanted to emphasize. Robin Hood is another good example of a legend. Again, there's not really, as far as I know, there's not a lot of historical evidence that a Robin Hood character existed. One interesting theory I did hear about, though, is that the name Robin Hood is kind of like the Dread Pirate Roberts from the movie The Princess Bride, in that it wasn't a name for a specific person, but rather it was a title that different people used. Next, there are urban legends, and these are actually considered a genre within folklore. These are stories that are often told and passed around with the belief that they are true. And in fact, sometimes urban legends are actually based on true events. Sometimes an urban legend is only partly true, and other times they are completely false. Urban legends are interesting because they can span a variety of topics, including historical events, music, art, popular culture, people, places, and politics. And urban legends can also cover other situations as well. A good example is there's a legend that if your college roommate dies during the semester, that you get an A for all your classes, because the theory is that if you come back from class one day and find that your roommate hung himself or overdosed on something, that you would be so distraught you wouldn't be able to focus and concentrate for the rest of the semester, so they would give you an A out of sympathy. Another urban legend that I always enjoyed was the story of the haunted house that was supposedly so scary no one ever managed to make it through. Now, the original version I remember hearing is that the haunted house was set up in a building with 5 floors, and it usually cost a lot of money to get in. When I first heard this story back in about the early 90s, I think it was like $50, which, again, I don't know how much $50 in the early 90s is in today's money, but the legend would often go that for every floor that you managed to get through, you would get $10 refunded. And if you made it all the way through, you would get all your money. However, some versions of the story say that you only get a refund if you make it to the end. Now, why can't anyone make it to the end? Sometimes it's not because it's scary. It's because you might be somewhere near the the exit, and one of the staff members might push you down a slide, and therefore you can't get to the exit. Or you might have to do something so dangerous to get to the exit, it's not worth getting your money back. Another one of my favorite urban legends is the story that the legendary rock group Van Halen destroyed a locker room or a dressing room area because they found brown M&Ms in the dressing room. The reason I like this story is because it's actually a mix of real events that got slammed together to form a bigger story. So the story goes that Van Halen had a part of their rider that listed the snacks that they wanted in the dressing room area. And one of them was a bowl of M&Ms with all of the brown M&Ms picked out. And that was actually true because Van Halen used a lot of equipment in their shows for the time. So they wanted to make sure that the venue that was hosting them had read through everything. And I think it was David Lee Roth mentioned that, so if they got in the the locker room or the dressing room and saw there was a bowl that didn't have the brown M&Ms picked out, it was pretty clear they didn't read everything, so they could cancel the show without any penalty to them. Now, the reason they did this is there's a lot of stuff that the venue may not have thought about. For example, they had to make sure that the power system of the venue would be able to supply the electricity they needed without causing the power to go out or without causing a fire. But there's also other things you might not think about. Like, for example, the doors to getting into the venue area had to be a certain size so they could get their equipment through. Another thing that people probably don't think about is the floor had to be able to withstand a certain number of pounds of pressure per square inch. And this is where the legend gets fun, because the story goes that they had played at a college campus, and the people who hosted that particular show didn't read the rider, and the floor of the gymnasium, as it turned out, was not strong enough to support their stage, and it caused, I think it was like $80,000 worth of damage. That number actually got mixed in with the story about them destroying the dressing room. And David Lee Roth did confirm that did actually happen. But in that case, it was only $12,000 worth of damage. And again, this was early 80s dollars, so only $12,000, which, or as he put it, $12,000 worth of fun. I'm not sure how much that would be in today's dollars. Finally, we have fairy tales. This is another genre within folklore. These are stories that often involve magic, monsters, and fantasy creatures like elves, dwarves, dragons, and, of course, fairies. Now, the line between fairy tales and myth or legend is often a little blurry, so I'm not sure how modern folklorists really define that difference. However, I wouldn't say that the main qualifier for a fairy tale is that it was lighthearted and written for children. Some of them can actually get quite macabre. A good example is the classic story of Cinderella. In the Brothers Grimm version of this tale, the evil stepsisters actually cut off part of their foot in an effort to be able to fit into the slipper. They also had their eyes plucked out by doves when they tried to attend their sister's wedding. How can we use folklore as a way to get inspiration for Dungeons and Dragons? Now, first, we can look at weapons. And this is a subject that I've already covered quite a bit. If you go back in my Geekery in General catalog, you'll see that I did actually do several episodes called Legendary Weapons, where I discussed weapons from places like ancient Greece, Russia, Scandinavia, Western Africa, and even some modern stories like some of the swords that General Washington had. Well, let me go back. Not necessarily modern, but more recent, at least as far as history is concerned. Armor. Sometimes you can find special types of armor within the works of folklore and legend. And of course, there's plenty of magic items, such as flying carpets. You've got the pipes of Pan. You can also find things like invisibility potions, love potions, poison potions, magic rings. Folklore is also a really good place to look when you want inspiration to design swords. Now, these weapons were often treated with great reverence. In part, this was due to the time and money that went into making one, so usually only a wealthy warrior or a noble could afford one. There's often other stories that go along with swords. A good example comes from Japan, and that is the story of Masamune and Muramasa. If you're a fan of video games, you probably recognize those names because the names Muramasa and Masamune often appear in different games, usually as a katana or a powerful sword of some type. These weapons are named after two historical Japanese swordsmiths, Goro Nudio Masamune and Muramasa Sengo. Now, legends say that Muramasa was the student of Masamune, but the two men actually lived several decades apart. But in one story I heard about them, they were said to be the opposites of each other. Masamune was calm and peaceful, while Muramasa was said to be bloodthirsty and evil. Muramasa's swords are often associated with evil or with bad luck because it was said a shogun cut himself while handling one of his swords. However, Masamune's swords are often associated with more positive traits, and this is actually not uncommon to see this carried over into video games, where Muramasa swords are often have a darkness element to them, while a sword named after Masamune is often a holy sword or one infused with the power of light. Now, there's certainly several legends about these two swordsmiths, but according to one legend, the two of them decided to have a contest to see who could make the better sword. According to one variation, the two men placed their swords in a river. Muramasa's sword cut anything that came into contact with it, while Masamune's sword cut nothing. So Muramasa bragged that he had bested his teacher, but a monk observing the contest proclaimed Masamune's sword to be superior since it did not harm the innocent. And one of the fun things about looking through works of folklore is the magic items that you can gain inspiration from don't even necessarily have to be powerful swords or weapons or suits of armor. There's some that are actually interesting in they could be useful to an adventurer, but they're not necessarily what you would call a powerful weapon. Now, I don't recall where I heard it, but I remember hearing about a story of a Russian tablecloth that it was said when you lied it on the ground and then unrolled it, food and dishes would appear. And then you rolled it back up, and then the food and dishes would be reset, and the next time you use this item, you'd have more food and with clean dishes. So again, not necessarily something powerful, but if you're talking about a group of adventurers who are constantly wandering around, this is something that would be very helpful to them. Now, we can also look to folklore to gain inspiration for various character archetypes. Russian folklorist Vladimir Prop did a considerable amount of work analyzing the structure of various folktales and came up with 7 different roles or character types that we often see in these stories. The first is the villain, and of course this is our antagonist, the person who creates problems for the hero. Next is the dispatcher. Now, if we're going to borrow some terminology from Joseph Campbell and his Hero of 1,000 Faces, the dispatcher would be the person who issues the call to adventure. He's the person who sends the hero on their way and often gives them advice for how to start their journey. Next, there's the helper. This is typically a magical entity of some kind that helps the hero in their quest. Sometimes they do so by offering protective charms or magic, or sometimes they might give weapons. If we're going to look at science fiction as an example, we could say that Obi-Wan in Episode 4, A New Hope, fits this role because he gives Luke Skywalker his lightsaber, or rather his father's lightsaber. Next, there is the prize. So this can be a physical object or it can be a person. A good example would be the princess or the damsel in distress. Next is the donor. So a donor would be similar to a helper, but what the donor will do is they will usually prepare the hero by testing them. And if they pass the test, they give him some sort of aid, like a magical item or maybe safe passage through an area. Then, of course, there's the hero himself or herself, the person who rises up, meets all challenges, and defeats the villain in the end. But there's not always a hero in a story. There can also be a false hero. This is a figure who tries to take credit for the hero's deeds, and in the end, usually is found out and receives some sort of punishment. So if we're looking at some different archetypes you can use, there's the wise old man or wise old woman. So this is an older person who usually gives some sort of advice. There's also the archetype of the evil stepmother and the evil stepsister. So if you have a hero who comes from a poor or humble background, then they make life difficult for the hero, often trying to keep him or her down. Good example would be the stepmother and stepsisters from Cinderella. And of course, no fairy tale is complete without a knight in shining armor and a princess in distress. A lot of fairy tales often have the fairy godmother, usually a female fairy of some kind, who offers charms or other forms of protection for the hero. The characters might also either meet or become the child in the forest. So probably the best example I can think of for this would be Hansel and Gretel. And then it's also common for the hero to encounter various supernatural helpers, some of whom who will sometimes take the form of a talking animal. Now, in addition to these archetypes, there's also a variety of places that are common in the works of folklore and fairy tales. There's the enchanted forest. So this is not just a normal forest with bears and wolves and deer and rabbits, but the enchanted forest is often home to elves, fairies, unicorns, and various other magical creatures. It's also common for the hero to make a journey into either the underworld or an underwater world, which both of these would be exceptional because these are places where a normal person normally cannot go. So in order to enter the underwater world, for example, the hero might need to seek a supernatural helper of some kind to receive a spell or an item that'll protect them. A modern example of this would be in the Harry Potter movies, Goblet of Fire, where Neville gives Harry a magical herb that allows him to breathe underwater. Though I believe in the books was actually Dobby the elf who gave him this item. Same thing for the underworld. Sometimes you need special means in order to access it. Other times it's as simple as going down a deep cave. But in any case, you'll have to be careful because dangerous monsters will often lurk within the underworld. There's also the land in the sky. Probably the classic example of this would be Jack and the Beanstalk, where the hero, Jack, has to climb the beanstalk into the clouds where he finds the giant's castle and then gets away with the giant's treasure. And of course, there's also another classic example, the tower occupied by a witch or wizard. And witches or wizards are always fun to use in campaigns because they can be either friends or foes. Often the giver of advice or gifts, but sometimes their aid comes with a price. Folklore can also be a good place to look for plot hooks or other ideas you can use in your role-playing game story. A common example of something you'll see in folklore and fairy tales is a test of virtue. A good example of this would be the legend of Frau Holly. So in this story, there is a girl who is being raised by her stepmother and her stepsister. So again, that archetype of the evil stepsister and evil stepmother. And it was said that the stepmother forced the daughter to do all of the work while she let her own daughter live a life of leisure. Well, one day the daughter accidentally drops her spindle into a well. Now she doesn't want to be punished for losing it, so she jumps in to get it. However, once she enters the well, she doesn't find herself underwater, she finds herself in a meadow. And as she's walking along, she encounters an oven, and she hears cries for help. And the bread inside the oven asked her to take them out so they don't burn. And she did what was asked. As she continued on her journey, she came across an apple orchard, and she heard the apples crying out for help, that they needed to be picked before they rotted and fell to the ground. So the girl picked the apples. Well, eventually she gets to the home of Frau Holly, where the Frau says that she can stay as long as she's willing to help out around the house. So the girl does what's asked of her. She works hard, but eventually she becomes homesick and asks to leave. So the Frau leads her to a gate, gives her the spindle that she dropped, and sent her on home. And as soon as she stepped out of the gate, she was showered with gold as a reward for her hard work. Well, she gets home and she tells her stepmother and stepsister about her adventure. Now, the stepmother, of course, wants the same fortune for her own daughter, so she tells her to do the same thing. So the stepsister goes to the well and drops the spindle in and jumps down. She also finds herself in the meadow. She also comes across the oven, but she doesn't help the bread and lets it sit in there to burn. Next, she comes to the apple orchard, but she doesn't pick the apples and continues on her way. Finally, she gets to the home of the Frau. And again, the Frau invites her to stay as long as she works, but the stepsister, being accustomed to a life of leisure, does a poor job at the tasks she's given. So eventually, she's allowed to go home, but this time when she exits the gates, the evil stepsister is showered with pitch, and the Frau tells her that is what you have earned. So again, a story about why you want to do a good job doing your housework and your chores, because you'll be rewarded, but if you do a half-assed job, you'll get punished. Another common theme we see are tests of courage. And a good example here would be Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, I believe this story is actually quite long, so the short, abridged version is that Arthur and his knights are celebrating Christmas when they are interrupted by a green man. So his skin is green and his hair is green, and depending on the version, he's either dressed in green armor or sometimes he's just dressed in green clothing. And according to some folklorists, he's supposed to be a representation of Jack in the Green, or the wild man. Well, the Green Knight challenges one of the men of the Round Table to chop off his head with his axe, on the condition that he's allowed to return the strike a year and a day later. And Sir Gawain is the only one who is willing to take up this challenge. So he cuts off the man's head and is surprised when he gets back up and puts his head back on. Well, a year and a day passes, and Sir Gawain meets up with the Green Knight. But he flinches when the knight is about to cut off his head. So feeling ashamed, he agrees not to move out of the way again. Well, the Green Knight brings the axe down, but instead of cutting off his head, he just gives him a little nick and congratulates him for his courage, and that broke the spell that was cast upon this knight. Another common theme we see in folklore is an enemy that can only be defeated by a special weapon or by exploiting a specific weakness. I've got a couple examples here. The first is the English tale of the Lambton worm. This story involves a man named John Lambton. One day he decided to skip church in order to go fishing. After church ended, he caught a small eel-like creature and dropped it down a well. As the years passed, the worm grew larger and poisoned the well. Well, the creature becomes a danger as it starts taking livestock and children. During this time, though, John was off fighting in the Crusades. When he comes home, he finds that his family's fortunes are destitute. And his father tells him the story about how this beast appeared from the well, and the only way to pacify it was by giving it daily offerings of food or milk. Many villagers and knights tried to slay the creature, but all failed because whenever they cut off a piece of the beast's body, it was able to reattach itself. Well, John seeks advice from a witch, who tells him to cover his armor with spearheads and to fight it in a river. However, after defeating the worm, he must kill the first thing he sees. If he fails to do this, his family will be cursed for 9 generations. So he creates a plan with his dad that after he kills the worm, he'll blow his horn, and that will summon his hunting dog. So he comes up with a plan with the aid of his father. John will fight the beast, and after defeating it, he will blow his hunting horn 3 times. And at this time, his father will release his dog so the dog can be killed, and thus the family can avoid the curse. So the reason John was told to fight the worm in the water is because his armor would help him slice off pieces of the worm's body, and when they fell into the river, they were washed away before they could be reattached. So he successfully kills the beast and blows his horn. But sadly, his father forgot the plan and went to greet him instead. And since he couldn't bring himself to kill his father, his family was cursed. Another story involves a very well-known creature within the Dungeons & Dragons universe, and that is the Tarrasque. So in Dungeons & Dragons, it's pictured as this massive, world-ending monster that just goes on this destructive rampage where it can just destroy and obliterate anything in its path. Its roots come from a French legend. The creature was described as follows: a huge dragon, half animal, half fish, fatter than a bull, longer than a horse. It had the face and head of a lion, teeth sharp as swords, the mane of a horse. Its back was hatchet sharp with bristly scales keen as augers, 6 feet with bear-like claws, the tail of a serpent, and a double shield like a tortoise shell on each side. So no weapon could harm this monster. So in order to help them, the village called a woman named Saint Martha. She managed to subdue the monster using her cross in holy water and then led it back to town so it could be killed. You've probably heard of the Grateful Dead, and I'm sure most people are now thinking of a rock band. However, the Grateful Dead is another theme that we see in fairy tales and folklore. This story involves an encounter with a ghost who was either never given a proper burial or who died with unpaid debts. So when you're using the Grateful Dead in a game, what'll happen is the players can encounter this spirit, and after finding out what needs to be done, they could complete a task, and then the ghost will reward them, perhaps by leading them or giving them directions to a treasure of some kind. We also see the theme of breaking a curse or a spell. Probably the best example I can think of comes from modern folklore, and that is taking rocks from Mount Kilauea in Hawaii. Now, supposedly, taking rocks from this place will cause bad luck until the rock is returned. And supposedly every year, the Hawaiian National Park Service receives boxes of rocks from people who claim that they took it, then they started to suffer bad luck, so they mailed it back to the park. However, it is believed this is not an authentic belief, but rather this was made up by tour bus drivers who were tired of cleaning up after tourists who got dirty while going off the trail to collect rocks. We also see the story of the Sleeping King or the King Under the Mountain. This can involve a great hero or king who is sleeping underground until his nation needs him again. King Arthur is a good example. Another example are the Blue Hills in Connecticut. Local tribes told a tale of how an evil giant named Hobomok was imprisoned here by the Great Spirit. So if you're going to use this as an idea for a campaign, you could have it that the evil spirit or monster that is trapped underneath the mountain is freed. Maybe the characters did it by accident, or maybe someone else did it. But in either case, now the heroes have to right this wrong and they have to defeat the monster. Finally, there are many tales in folklore of supernatural gifts. One of my favorite is the Slavic legend of a hero named Janosik. He's often compared to the Polish version of Robin Hood. It is believed that he's based on a real person. However, like many legends, over time, various stories were told about him, and not all of them had a grain of truth. There's a couple different versions of his story, but in the beginning, he receives 3 gifts. A magical weapon called a kiełpaga, which is a Polish mountaineer's axe, a magic hat, a magic shirt, and a magic belt. The axe was said to have a variety of different powers based on the source you consult. Some say that you could throw it and it would return to your hand. Others say that it could fight by itself. The shirt was said to be able to protect him from bullets and other harm. And then the belt was said to give him leadership abilities. There's a couple different stories I've heard for how he got these items. According to the first version I heard of the story, Janosik was a university student, but he grew tired of his life of studies and wanted to return home. As he was returning home, he sees a nobleman harassing a peasant. So he kills the nobleman and gives the noble's gold to this poor person. Well, as it so happens, a witch saw this encounter, and she tells Janosik that he is now an outlaw and can no longer live among normal men. So she gives him the 3 gifts and tells him to go form a band of highwaymen to return stolen riches to the poor. The other version I heard is that when he was returning home, he grew tired, and it was near dark. Well, he saw a cabin, and when he entered this cabin, he saw an old woman who said that he should go because her 2 sisters were going to be home soon, and they would not appreciate seeing a man here, and he would be killed. But Janosik said that, well, at least he wants to die with a full belly. So he asked if she could give him some food, and then he would do some chores and work for her. And she agreed. Well, when the woman's sisters got home, the 3 old women reverted to beautiful young women, which in some versions are apparently fairies, and in other versions say they're 3 goddesses. But they give Janosik his 3 gifts and ask him to right some of the wrongs that are taking place in the land. So he gets his gifts, and he goes and he forms his band of highway robbers. And again, it was believed that while they didn't necessarily always give to the poor, they at least tried not to bother them. And there was one story where they accidentally injured a priest, and they did whatever they could to help him, and they were generally sorry about what they did. Unfortunately, Janosik's life would come to an end. It was said that an old woman threw some dried peas in his front of him when he was trying to run away from the authorities, which caused him to slip and fall. So he was taken into custody, he was tried, and then executed by being hung on a hook. But like many great heroes, some say that he didn't die, but instead he is sleeping under the ground. Another example of the king under the mountain, but he's sleeping until the Slavic lands need him again. So there you have it, some ways you might be able to use folklore and fairy tales to get ideas for a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at www.poigamestudio.com. Follow me on most social media sites at POI Game Studio, and check out my music channel on YouTube at Al Seeger Music.